Hello, my name's Emily Day. I'm from Footprint Brighton. In our series of table talks, we'll be talking to different disciplines about the sorts of initiatives that we can be using to reduce carbon emissions from the built environment. Today I have with me Paul Monaghan, who's a founding director at AHMM, and also Dave Buckley from Envac, who's driving the development of their systems here in the UK. We're talking today about waste management. So Dave, what can you tell us about trends in waste management and what's been happening really over the last few years?
Not much really. We haven't seen an improvement in our recycling rates. I think the local authorities in the UK have blamed the fall in readership of newspapers, but we've also seen a massive increase in cardboard. Most people will have a number of Amazon deliveries a week and DPD deliveries a week and ASOS deliveries a week. But the message isn't getting across clearly. We don't have any engagement with the public. The public are told what to do. There's no news on where the recycling goes and what happens to it or the benefits of it. And we are just stuck. We're a long way behind the rest of Europe. In some cases, 30-40% behind the rest of Europe as a percentage, and there's not enough going on really to address that.
So I suppose the local authorities are charged with ensuring that we do our recycling and in terms of developing the recycling facilities that we've got. Paul, what have you seen happening in, the last sort of 15 years, the changes in what we're required to do as developers and designers of buildings?
Well, the answer is not much. Things haven't changed. I think that's the problem. The only thing that's changed is the stores for bins in bigger projects have got bigger and bigger. And of course, the issue with that becomes the viability of these projects. That certainly the projects we do in London, all of them are on a knife's edge in terms of viability. And that pushes the building either higher or makes it unviable. I think we rarely think about refuse as anything that can go even further in terms of its carbon credentials. I think we just assume there's recycling and that's what those big bin stores do, and there's nothing else we can do about it. And I'm really interested with David talking about how the work he's been doing can add to that.
I think one of the things you have to think about the space that's devoted to recycling facilities is actually the carbon it takes to build those structures.
Absolutely.
What happens in the most sort of tight urban sites? I've worked on projects where they've got to put the bin stores into the basements. That must be a very expensive thing to do, both in terms of cost and the carbon that it takes to put stuff in the basement.
Well, I suppose if you take a significant project, like we've done a lot at Elephant and Castle with Lendlease. So there's one of our bigger plots there has maybe about 300, 400 units in, so flats. There's a 30-storey tower and there's a double-storey plinth. That plinth needs to deal with the refuse, needs to get refuse lorries in. It needs to deal with disabled parking, which when you've got 400 flats is probably about 40 spaces. It needs to deal with other plant areas. And it needs to deal with bicycles, which now are hugely inflated, and quite rightly. So the problem with that, if you're starting off building a basement and a whole plinth at the ground floor, that's why you have to go 32 stories. And I'm not sure if going 32 stories is great for every city.
Yeah, and then actually in terms of the way that we construct those, the vehicle movements that it takes to dig out the basements and all of those things, they're kind of hugely destructive in a way.
It's one of the most carbon-eating areas of construction, basement, because it's almost all pure concrete. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, and I suppose in some of the less dense areas, some of the projects that you've worked on, it has an effect on the density and the grain of the streets that can be achieved.
Well, the difficulty with, say, dealing with refuse is how evasive it is within a project, and that has a massive effect on placemaking. And if you're doing a major project, the placemaking is so important. It's everything, because quite often there's not much to play with. You need to have more space. So I think whether it be that one has to travel into a building and make a whole ground floor much higher, or whether you're serving from the street, it means certain areas of parts of the project, the public realm around it, need to be available for turning circles, etc. So yeah, it's a huge issue, and one that I don't think, in all the projects I'm looking at, we don't particularly look at alternative ways of doing it. And of course, it's something that local authorities have a huge amount of say in, because they all have different bin lorries, they all have different systems for doing it. And in a way, they're not always the best people to do that.
Yeah, I suppose you were talking earlier about the fact that it would be a good idea if the big cities could have a joined up level of thinking about how they're going to approach waste management. One of the authorities that you've been working with is Tower Hamlets, and they're actually out for consultation at the moment on a new SPD about what they're going to expect from developers generally. And they've got sort of two targeted levels. One's underground refuse collections. I don't know if you've got any experience of those, but then the next sort of gold standard would be the automated sort of vacuum waste systems. Can you tell us, Dave, a bit about the difference in waste collections that people would expect to see if they were moving from a normal bin collection system to that?
Yeah, I take the view, the same view as Paul has said, if nothing changes, nothing is going to change. And as I said earlier, we're stuck at just about 40% recycling, which we've been at probably for the last decade. And you know, all of the impact of the vehicles and the emissions from the vehicles and, as I said, turning circles and the way buildings and developments are built, there are alternatives. So AWCS is instead of a weekly collection or a fortnightly collection, it's a 4 times a day collection, which means the amount of space that collection needs to take is much, much smaller, under 15% of the space in the basement. And that is basically storage equipment ready for the waste to be pulled to a different part of the development. And from a user perspective, you are not taking your bags of waste down into the basement. You're actually depositing them in the garden, in the lobby. You could actually deposit your waste on your floor if you live in a tall building. And as a result, you sort of buy into it and you are capable of recycling at a much higher level. And we've seen 4 or 5 times the London average for high density property and recycling rates, simply because we make it cleaner and more available. And I think that is not the solution for every development, because there is a cost associated with that. But ultimately, I think if you are looking at placemaking, then you're going to get a better result. And I think from a waste perspective, you know, an RCV or a dust cart is basically a Victorian horse and cart. Every other facility, every other utility has been brought into the modern age except for waste. And I think waste should be treated as a utility, and it should have a proper place in the planning process, that it's actually where it should be, and it should be done properly.
I think you were telling me earlier it's something like 10% of the vehicle movements that are necessary if you're extracting the waste to a centralised point to collect it. That's got to have a fantastic improvement on air quality and carbon emissions generally.
Absolutely. I think if you are collecting the waste from one point, as opposed to running the vehicle either through the car parks or around block to block on a bigger development, then yeah, the vehicle emissions will be much, much smaller. You're taking a bigger volume of waste out on one vehicle. You're only taking 15 minutes to pick that volume up, rather than a dust cart spending all day going round and round and round. And I think, yeah, you know, the benefits of that are from all sorts of reasons, from emissions, from safety, from the way you build the roads, from the turning circles, are completely different.
So when you say you could deposit things on your floor, if you're in a 15-storey building, you're on the top floor, who then takes that waste that's on your floor? Is that part of what you would envisage being done by someone else? Who's doing that?
No, so what you would, with an AWCS system, is you drop your waste into one of a single chute or 2 chutes or 3 chutes.
Yeah.
The waste is then held in a storage tank.
Yeah.
In a chamber in the basement, which traditionally takes 15% of the space of the bins.
Yeah.
And then we have a pipe which pulls the waste from that storage tank to the collection facility, which doesn't have to be in that building. It can be in another part of the development, which is serviced from one location, and it's much more convenient, much easier.
And I believe you did that in Wembley with Quintain, with the huge housing projects that have been going on there.
So absolutely established method of doing it. It's not just Wembley, we do it in the Middle East, we do it in the Far East. Other companies do it as well. It's not just Envac that is the only supplier of the system. But yes, effectively with Quintain, the waste is collected from one point
Yeah.
And we have 23 blocks connected to that point.
Yeah.
And that was part of the sort of funding model for how to put in a system like this, was because of the space that it released for the developers to put other things in ground floors like you were talking about.
Yeah, and I suppose, Emily, the issue is that Quintain are a very big developer with a huge regeneration project. So, there's maybe 30 blocks of housing there, isn't there? And what I'm interested in as well is how that, when does the cut-off point be in terms of viability? Could you do it for one smaller scheme, or is it? I suppose that would be interesting to a lot of people.
Yeah, it can be done. It's scalable. I think you need to be looking at maybe 300 or 400 before it's viable. The collection facility is smaller for a smaller project. It's possible to collect the waste via a mobile collection facility as well. Right. And it's just multiply up in scale then. We have a second project in London, in Barking Riverside, where the Envac system is replacing 19,000 plastic bins.
Oh, right, okay. Well, we're doing a project there, just about to go on site with it. So that's interesting. So maybe I should know about it.
Maybe, that's fine, that's okay. And it's, I could probably give you the number, in fairness, it's one of 3 or 4 that are starting. But again, from their perspective, it's a placemaking exercise. It's not to have, the 19,000 bins is 3 vehicles on site going round and round and round all day. With Barking Riverside, it'll be 24 collections a week. Right. So you think of the vehicle movements, the emissions, and all the fumes that the school kids out there are going to breathe in. So they've done it on a much lower density. So whereas you get blocks at Wembley which are 35 stories high, serviced by Envac, at Barking they're no more than 5 or 6 stories high. All of the collection points are either in streets or in gardens. And they're built to a certain look and feel, quite Scandinavian in fairness, but they spent a lot of time thinking about the best way to look after the waste. And quite honestly, they didn't want the bins, they didn't want the plastic 2-wheel bins outside their homes, and they didn't want the vehicle movements. So fantastic. Different ethos behind the project.
And what I'm interested in as well, if you look at offices and the office world, what's changed is that companies want to have a building that is BREEAM outstanding. They don't want BREEAM very good, they don't want BREEAM excellent, they want outstanding. And they want that because the generation that are coming through, so the 20 and 30-year-olds, the brightest, they all want the brightest people working for them, demand that. They're much more environmentally, I suppose, they want to fight for that. So that's turning the office market into something that's very different, where people absolutely want it. That doesn't happen in housing. Housing is still generated on, if you can get a 2-bedroom flat and it's 300 grand or it's 325 grand, people still, price is the trigger point. But I think the tide is turning where people want to demand more out of their housing. And what I'm interested in is what the marketing possibilities of what you're talking about, which is the statistics you give about the normal, how much is recycled. Did you say it's 50% normally?
No, it's 40%.
40%
average.
So people probably confused that while they might, in an individual home be able to do that to a much finer tuning level, why we're not getting that on bigger schemes. And I think that then when you look at how schemes get marketed, the sustainability is going to be a really key part of it in the future, and the carbon cutting element.
Yeah, I think if you look at London as an average for high density living, it's 11 or 12% recycling, right? Which is terrible. I mean, but if you think of a underground car park with waste bins in it, you go in and you throw whatever into whatever bin you want.
You don't really want to be there down in the basement dealing with your bags, do you?
And then you have to service that. You have to get the container recycled, swapped over, because that waste is going to be there for a week. And then you've got to try and get that container to the vehicle. It might be in the basement, but it's probably outside. I think if you look at London developments, the railway station or the tube station is always the key thing. Every single one is marketed that the new railway station opens, you're 20 minutes from central London, this is why you live here. But more and more now, I think local authorities are fed up with spending X amount of 100,000 putting a vehicle on the road, having to crew it, and basically having the issues of congestion, having the issues of, if you think of Tower Hamlets with the vehicles driving around the Isle of Dogs, they're basically, all you ever see there are buses or dust carts. You never see anything else. And I think they're looking for alternatives.
Yeah.
And I think pulling waste into the 21st century instead of it being the 19th century, I think is a big part of the local authority thinking. And waste has never really sat anywhere within the planning hierarchy.
Yeah.
It's something that you do your best, and hopefully, it'll be enough, but it's never had been signed off at any level. And I think London authorities are now looking at what the best solution is for each of the developments.
Right.
So hopefully that will push through in the next decade into waste being considered properly, and everything that goes with it, the emissions, the user experience, the vehicle movements as a result, and how it fits in the placemaking.
Yeah, and ultimately resulting in less carbon emissions derived from the built environment, which is one of the main things that we're here to talk about. Mm-hmm. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very much both for joining me. I hope we'll be able to continue this conversation for it to have moved further forwards by the time we get together in person down in Brighton. Mm-hmm. And just remains to say thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks.